Good morning. So good to be with you this morning. I really appreciate Andrew reading that for us and for Daniel curating the songs that he did. We're in a series called The Power of One. And the whole series thesis essentially is to look at the way we are called to live a life as a Christian. And to condense that down and to not be overwhelmed by the volume of what needs to be done, but rather to look at individual opportunities that we're given. And to we've looked at invitation, we've looked at welcome, and as I'm sure you've gathered by our reading and the songs we've talked about and sang this morning, we're going to talk today about serving one. About individually finding the needs of one person and meeting those needs, and to continually make this a cycle, not just a one-off, but to go out to find a need, to meet the need, and then return, find another, meet another, return, find another, meet another, and to continue this process the same way, simultaneously welcoming, inviting, and we're going to talk next week about praying for one, and we're going to end our series looking at sharing with one. And you kind of combined all that together, and you've defined the life of a Christian, right? I mean, certainly in simplest terms, but that is the life of a Christian. We're going to start our morning together looking in John chapter 13. John 13, and I'd like for you to turn over to there, and if you're already in the gospel, slip over to Matthew 25. We'll be there rather quickly. But I want to look at two examples of service, because we have this tension in our minds of how to best serve. And Jesus gives us examples of both. And so both are good, and we want to be able to utilize both as we go out and to serve others. We look in John 13, starting in verse 12, and this is a story I know you're familiar with. This is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It's this beautiful example of what it is to serve as a humble servant. And that the song Daniel just led for us, servant song, or you might know it as Make Me a Servant. Lord, make me like you. This is to become like Christ, is to wash the feet of others, right? To be willing to do what's required. And so what we're going to do this morning is to really look at both of the examples of service we find in Scripture from Christ, one of which is discipled, we see more in John 13, which is this idea of serving in whatever way is required, from the lowest of the low up to the greatest of responsibilities. But then we're also going to look over in Matthew 25 and see the parable of the talents, which is kind of the flip side of the coin, which is using your God-given abilities to do what you're uniquely capable of. And there's this kind of good tension in our minds of being able to do both. And I'll give you a more succinct definition of what I would describe as Christian service, which combines both of these, of being willing to do whatever is needed, including washing someone's feet, up to finding the unique areas that you're qualified to meet those needs, right? And that's kind of the back and forth that we see of Christ. But let's start here in John 13, 12 through 17. It says, when he had washed their feet, he put on his outer garments and resumed his place. He said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so am I. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. We look at this example of Christ, of going and washing feet, of being willing to serve in whatever capacity is required. And we think to ourselves, how do we define Christian service, right? We talk about service a lot. We talk about serving others. But if pressed, how would we define what it means to serve, what I'm called to do, right? Part of living a life as Christian is knowing what's asked of us. Invitation, welcome, hospitality seem a little more straightforward, but service, how do you define this? I've kind of put these two just to kind of give us some sense of scale here. We have the I will do whatever's needed. I find this in John 13. It's not the only place you can find this, but it's I'm willing to do whatever's needed. That's part of service. But then you look at the flip side, which we're going to look at in a moment, Matthew 25, I will do what I'm uniquely qualified to do. And every one of us has a fit in this category as well. You and I are all given abilities and talents to go out into the kingdom and do unique, special things. And we would be underserving the kingdom. We'd be underserving the Father if we only did the first category, that I'll just do whatever comes across my plate first, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but are you uniquely qualified to go do something special? But also, if we just wait for those special opportunities, a lot of other things pass us by. And so we have to be able to capture both of these. And here's how I'm going to redefine and give you a suggestion for a definition for service. I will serve others in whatever way is needed. That's kind of the John 13 side, while looking for ways to utilize my unique talents. That's the Matthew 25 side. So you see how they can run parallel together. They can run simultaneously together. And as Christians, we are called to go out and utilize them both simultaneously. I'll do whatever is needed, but I'm going to look for those special ways that I am specially qualified to go and to meet together. So let's look at the flip side of this, which is Matthew 25. And this is really where we're going to spend probably the most of our time this morning. Because I really want, as a congregation, for us to have this really defined understanding of what it means to serve, and to figure out how you are uniquely capable of serving in some particular area of ministry. We can't cover all of that in one sermon. And so we're going to have later in the year an entire sermon series dedicated to how we're able to define and perhaps even figure out what you're capable of. And that is something we see taught to us all throughout Scripture, is utilizing your gifts that are given to you. We're going to gloss over it briefly, but just know there's going to be more study to come on this. But we look in Matthew 25, one of my absolute favorite parables. And Jesus taught in parable probably more than any other vehicle, because it's simply telling a story that the audience can initially understand, and it really illustrates a higher principle. And so we look at this parable in 25, starting in verse 14, and we'll read down to verse 30. That's the entire parable. And just keep your finger there, because every point we look at this morning is going to be a derivative of Matthew 25. This is the parable of the talents. For it was like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So he also who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 went and dug it in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of his servants came and settled accounts with him. And he who had received the 5 came forward, bringing 5 more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you have delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you gathered no seed. I was afraid, and I want you to notice that. We're going to come back to it. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But the master answered him, notice the response, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I had not sown and gathered where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have at least invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was mine with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who will more will be given, and he who will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, into the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I want to set this stage for us again. We have a master, and again, this is very eloquently describing judgment, right? That the master, which is God, has given these 3 people. He went away. He gave 3 servants a different portion according to his ability. And we could read into that all day long, and we'll touch on it briefly, the nuance of it. But he gave 3 servants 3 different allotments of property, of money. A talent was just a unit of weight, but it really represented money in the first century. And so he gave them these different weights, and he said, I'm going to go away, and you watch over this. The 5, the 2 talent man, went and invested it essentially, and had more to give when the master came back. The one with the 1 talent said, well, master, I was afraid I would lose it. I was afraid that I would not invest it correctly, whatever the case might be. So I buried it so that you at least have what you gave me, no more, no less. And you see the response that the one talent man gave. The master was pleased with the first two. Well done, good and faithful servant. Come into the joy of your master. But the one that buried the talent, he said, go away. Cast him into where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And of course, this is a description of what judgment is going to be like. God has given every one of us talents. He knows exactly what he's given us, and he expects us to utilize it. And so this morning, I want to give us some ideas that derive from Matthew 25 on how we're able to go out and to serve better. And then I want you to apply this by finding the one. And I've given you this question every week. Who is your one? Right? Who is the one you're going to invite? Who is the one you might welcome? Today, I want us to identify how are we going to use the principles of Matthew 25 to find your one to serve. Whether it be in your community, whether it be here at church, there's lots of ways we can utilize service. But I want us to find one need that you can meet. And again, it might be a John 13 need, which is I'll serve in whatever way I can find. Or it might be a Matthew 25 need. Because you notice, at the beginning here, it says he entrusted his property to the one he gave 5, to another 2, according to his ability. Right? That's the Matthew 25 side. That's the you and I each have unique abilities that God has given you. And part of that ability is natural God-given ability. Some of that is God placing you in careers that have given you skills that can be utilized. Some of that, but it all stems from what God has blessed us with, that you are uniquely capable of. That's the Matthew 25 service that we're going to look at. First point this morning is you are the Lord's servant. Coming out of Matthew 25, you are the Lord's servant. We look through this and recognize that God is the master, that we are the servants that are serving him, that hope to grow what he's given to us. I love how it's read in 1 Corinthians 6. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20 says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Friends, please recognize whether it's invitation, whether it's welcome, whether it's service, whether it's prayer, whether it's Bible study, whatever component we're thinking about, recognize the truth of 1 Corinthians 6. You are not your own. God has paid the price for you and me, and that's really the relationship we see here in Matthew 25, that this master had come and given away this property to his servants, and the servants recognized that it was not theirs. That there was this urgency, there was this eagerness to earn, to grow, because they recognized it wasn't theirs to begin with. You know, when it's not yours, when it's not mine, when somebody's entrusted something to me, maybe you're this way, we're extra diligent to take good care of it, to make sure it's returned in good condition. Friends, don't think of your abilities in any other way. Right? God has given them to you. Think of it in the same way as somebody's lent you anything else. You're going to take great care of it. You want to return it in better condition than when you got it. That's the way we're called to treat our fellow man. How much more should we be that way with the things God has entrusted us with? We are the Lord's servant. Number 2 is that you're unique. And again, we look through this parable and we recognize that each man was given a different allotment based on his ability. And there's lots of commentators that kind of want to break apart what all that means. But I think in the very broadest sense, it is each of these men probably had different backgrounds. They may have had different levels of experience. They may have had different skills. But they were unique. Each one was unique, and the master gave as he deemed fit. I want to spend a little bit of time here because a lot of times, and this is going to lead us into point 3 as well, but we look at this and we think, well, how great is the 5-talent person or the 2-talent, right? They were given more, and so the master must have loved them extra. I would hate to be the 1-talent person. I have a lesson called the 1-talent Christian because we think that woe is me for being the 1-talent person. We're going to look here in a minute. I think that 1 talent's worth more than you think. The master gave to each one as he had deemed fit. Matthew 15, I want to reread this. For he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and the other, each according to his ability. And then he went out on his journey. Friends, you are uniquely capable. God has given you abilities based on your uniqueness. He knows where you're going to go, who you're going to interact with. He knows who you're going to come in contact with. And he's given you abilities and skills in order to meet the needs of the kingdom where you are. You are unique. Are we able to utilize those abilities? 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 6, then we'll jump ahead to verse 11. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same God at work. All those who are the work of one and the same Spirit, and He distributes them to each just as He determines. And there's a beautiful ambiguity and uniqueness that comes with Scripture like this, because that's part of the role of the Spirit. That the Spirit distributes gifts according to how He determines, and that's beautiful amongst each and every one of us. That's the reason Paul describes the church like a body, because he recognizes that there's uniqueness in some of us are feet, some of us are hands, some of us are eyes, some of us are ears. There's uniqueness there, and that's what you've heard me say this however many times, and I'll continue to say it. You're uniquely qualified to minister to somebody. And what I mean by that is you go out into your workplace, your home, your schools, where you have unique relationships with people that don't know me from Adam, may not know our elders, may not know our deacons, but they know you. You have that relationship. You are in a unique position to minister to them. That's part of the unique abilities, just as the Spirit determines. I read it one way. It says, now there are many things I can't do well, but if I focus on what I can't do, I won't get much done. I've got to recognize and accept my unique gifts and abilities and put them to work. Perhaps the third servant, referencing Matthew 25, looked at the other two and thought, I don't have 5 or even 2, just 1. What's the use? Why try? Stop worrying about what you don't have and start using what you do have. Friends, that's where we are. Right? We oftentimes get into the trap of comparison of we look at the 2-talent person or the 5-talent person and we think, well, what's the point in me even doing anything? But friends, just like we've been talking about on Wednesday night, looking through the Christian Atheist, we've been looking at this idea of putting our abilities to work. We're talking about invitation. We're talking about welcome. Find where you can meet a need and meet it. I was thinking about that just this week, of how are we able to be better Christians. I mean, truly, when you simplify it back, when you really distill it down, it is serving God, and then it's going back out and doing the same thing He's done for us, albeit at a much smaller scale. God saw the need and He met it, right? He recognized that there was a sin need in the world, and He sent Christ to meet that need for me. Now I have the opportunity to go back out and to find other needs that need to be met and help meet them. And sometimes it is not me meeting the need, but it is me really just liaisoning. I'm just connecting 2 dots, right? Many times when you study with somebody, we're not the ones meeting that spiritual need, but we are the ones that get to have the blessing of helping guide them along that journey, studying with somebody or whatever. But maybe it is a physical need. But we look through this. Stop worrying about what we don't have and start utilizing what we do have. That's what set me back in my chair this week. We look through this parable. You are unique. You are greatly gifted. You are greatly, greatly gifted. And I think this is where I want us to dive in briefly into the difference between the 5, the 2, and the 1. Just doing a quick little bit of addition here. A talent was roughly worth a year's wage, plus or minus. And again, the conversion's not perfect because it is a unit of weight. Back then it was a unit of weight, but it represented a year's wage essentially. In the United States today, as of a few years ago, the average wage is $42,000 a year. Most people consider 40 years to be the working lifetime of most adults. So you recognize that $42,000, which is rather modest, but across the country, that's the average. Over a 40-year working span, you've got $1.7 million. So you look at a lifetime of work that is represented by this talent here, and you recognize, you might think, well, the 2-talent person, the 5-talent person, how much more do they have? But recognize that this talent is worth a little bit over $1.5 million in today's money. Does that feel more significant than when we go and we recognize the 2 and the 5? Friends, you're greatly, greatly gifted. Even looking at the 1-talent individual is still worth an immense amount of money. God looked at that one person and said, and perhaps the only differentiation between the 1 and the 2 could have just been age. He could have just said, well, this person's a little bit older, got a little bit more experience. I'll give him a little bit more. It has nothing to do with ability. It simply has to do with experience or age or background or whatever it might be. But friends, you're greatly gifted. The 1-talent person is worth so much. I heard it said one time, most people focus on the difference between the three men. And I think we all might be guilty of this from time to time. We look at others and we think how much more they might have, how much more I could do good. We think about the difference between the three, but we make too much of the difference and overlook the largeness of each gift. God has blessed all of his children with gifts. He knows them specifically and expects us to use them. Friends, that's true of all of us. God gave you and me the abilities we have. You know, you'll sometimes hear me say, we can fool each other. You can fool me. You can fool the church. You can fool the elders. I don't know exactly the gifts you've got. You don't know the gifts I've got, but God does. God gave them to me. He gave them to you. He gave them to all of us and knows exactly what we have and what we don't have. And we can rationalize with ourselves. We can pitch it to other people. I can't do this. I can't do this. But at the end of the day, you can't fool God. God knows exactly what you have, and there's going to come a day, we're going to talk about this here in a minute, where there's going to be an accounting. That's the easiest way to think about judgment coming. There's going to be accounting. There's going to be a reconciliation of God says, I've deployed these assets. If you want to think about it from a very financial standpoint, I've deployed these assets. I know what I've sent out. What am I receiving in return? And for many, there's going to be a large disparity in what God has sent because, again, God knows. Just in the same way that when you send out money, you know exactly where it goes, to the penny in most cases, because it's valuable. God thinks of it the same way. He's deployed gifts in his children to each and every one of us, and there's going to come a day where God says, I want an accounting of that, good and bad, the growth and the failures. And you notice, and we won't put the cart before the horse, but you know, we notice here that the master never seemed to be bothered by growth or failure. I think the other two, the 5 and the 2-talent person, could have come back with some sense of a loss. And I don't know that the master would have been all that fussed. He seemed more frustrated by the 1-talent man that didn't even try than by the results of anything. I think God views us the same way. God recognizes failures are going to come. We're going to try. We're going to slip and fall. But the true test of a Christian is, what am I going to do when I get back up? Right? How am I going to respond to adversity? You may recognize this is a rendition of the Pioneer 10 satellite that was sent out into space. And the goal of this was to send it to Jupiter. For a long time, the thought in astrology and astronomy was we could only get to Mars, that there's a pretty significant asteroid belt beyond that we couldn't get any data back from anything beyond Mars. So they sent out Pioneer 10. The Pioneer satellites are still being produced. I think they're on Pioneer 15 or 16 now, but this was supposed to be a 3-year mission. The astronauts that built this and the engineers put this together to have a working lifespan of 3 years. It was launched many years ago and ultimately went not only to Mars, got past Mars, got all the way to the end of the known solar system. And ultimately we lost contact with it in about 2003, which was 10, 15 years more than they ever expected to utilize something like this. What's amazing about the Pioneer 10 is the little device that sent pictures and things back was powered by a little 8-watt power cell. It's about the same output that a light bulb in our house utilizes. This tiny little 8-watt nothing, almost 7 billion miles from home, was still able to send these pictures and readings back. I look at this and it reminds me of the 1-talent person, but here's the truth of it. What seems small to you and me can become huge in God's hands. This little 8-watt power cell that feels so insignificant in the big scope, in the vastness of space, even in the largeness of Pioneer 10 itself. It's this tiny little unit that's responsible for its entire mission. The whole point of building it, the whole point of all the years put together was to get it to Mars and beyond, to send information back. And it was done by this tiny little chip, about the size of a D battery. What seems small to you and me, when we look in Matthew 25 and we see this 1-talent individual, is huge when God multiplies our efforts. Friends, don't forget that. You are greatly gifted. Number 4, you must put your gift to work. You're unique, you're greatly gifted, and God expects you to utilize the gifts that he's given to each of us. 1 Peter 4 and verse 10 says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. I don't know that it's any more succinct than anywhere else in Scripture. It points out so beautifully for us. Whatever gift you have, and I love the phraseology of that because that really defines many of us. Whatever the gift might be. And friends, there's a lot of us here that have a lot of very unique gifts and skills and abilities and backgrounds. And what Peter's talking about here is utilize that. Whatever it might be, as insignificant as you might think it is, might be the very thing that somebody needs to nudge them closer to Christ. It might be the very thing somebody needs in order to have a need met that's enabling them to come to know Christ even better. Utilize the gifts that you have. How can I put my gift to work? I hear this a lot. How can I put my gift to work? I think easily summed up, we can give it in 3 steps. First of which is we identify the gifts that we have. And again, we're going to do more study on this later in the year of how are we able to better identify that. But suffice it to say, my guess is that you already have some idea of at least a gift that you have that can benefit God's kingdom. You probably have a lot more than that, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on later, is identifying those things you may not even recognize as gifts. But my guess is that all of us can identify at least one. We identify what that might be. The next is to identify the passions that we have. God has given us abilities and passions within our lives, and the best way that I ever heard someone define passion is what wakes you up in the morning. What are you so excited about that when your foot hits the floor getting out of bed, that is the first thing on your mind? That is what you're passionate about. And it can be a variety of things, good and bad. But you identify the abilities you have, you identify what your passions are, and then you essentially combine those. And I'll give you some more techniques on that when we get to our spiritual gifts topic together. But then we find a need that is essentially the cross-reference between our passions and our abilities. We find a need, and then we go meet it. I know that is an oversimplification. There's more to it. It's not that easy. But in essence, that's it. How do I meet a need? How do I put my gifts to work? I figure out what I can do. I figure out what I love to do. And then I find where those two things cross, and I find a need, and I meet it. That is the Matthew 25 side, right? There's still the humility, the service side of John 13. And that's as simple as I'm going to go meet any need that I can identify. And if you need a list of those, come find any one of the elders, any one of the deacons, come find me, and we will give you a laundry list of needs that need to be met, many of which are the John 13 side. No special skills, no special anything other than the humble spirit to say I'm willing to go do it, whatever that might be. Number 5 is you'll succeed if you try. You will succeed if you try. But I want us to redefine what success is, because it may not be the definition you're used to. But there's a biblical definition of success that makes this 100% true. The one who tries, the one who keeps showing up faithfully using his or her gifts is the one who succeeds. I read that earlier this week. And it was this emphasis on, are you and I attempting to go out and do the kingdom work? Not focusing, again, just like we read in Matthew 25, we don't get any sense of the master saying, this is my criteria, I need to receive this percentage growth back, I need this, I need this. The only indication we have is really in the negative against the one talent person who wasn't even willing to try. That seemed to be the master's biggest thing. When you and I are willing to show up and faithfully use our gifts, we'll succeed. Here's my definition for success. Success is God will use your efforts for good. It's the same principle that comes out of the parable of the sower, right? That you and I are called to spread the seed. We are called to sow the seed. But in terms of the actual growth, I can't make the plant grow, but God can. I can't make the word infiltrate the heart of others, but God can. That's part of one of the gifts that the Spirit does, is help guide the word into willing hearts. But you and I are called to sow the seed. God will use our efforts for good. So with that level, with that definition of success in mind, we will succeed if we try. What that means is if we try, God will utilize our efforts for good, for His kingdom. We may never see the fruits of that, but recognize that's still success. Please don't ever judge success or failure in spiritual work based just on results, because there's most of the guidance that we're given in the New Testament is not results based, right? It is in the sense that souls are attached to this. We want to win souls for Christ, but that in essence is not our job. I can't force somebody to come to know Christ, but I can spread the gospel. That is what you and I are called to do. The actual process of pricking a heart and going and forgiving sins and things like that, that is completely on God, but you and I are called to be the hands and feet. The greatest danger is not failing. Josh talked about fear of failure this morning in his class. Many of us are hesitant to pursue service, to pursue invitation, to pursue welcome, to pursue all the things we're talking about in this class because we're afraid we'll fail. We're afraid that somebody might say no. We're afraid somebody might laugh at us. We're afraid we might not have the answer. We could go on and on and on and on and on about the things that we're fearful of. But recognize Matthew 25 gives us a pretty clear directive that the greatest danger is not failing, but it's not trying at all. Friends, when you and I try, again, the definition of success is God will use those efforts for good. Even if we don't see it on this side of eternity, God will utilize those efforts for good. When you understand how generously God has gifted you, that he ensures your success if you try, it ought to inspire some reckless abandon, a boldness to risk great things for God. He wants us to maximize our lives, make the most of our resources, and make a difference in the world. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things when they risk obeying him and use what they've got. Friends, God is ready to do extraordinary things if we're able and willing to try. That is the greatest emphasis with regards to our service. And lastly, we'll give an accounting. What I hope you've taken from this is you are extraordinarily gifted. God has given you the tools already to succeed. God only asks that you try. He's not asking for any particular result. And he also wants us to understand that one day there's going to be an accounting. That's the end of Matthew 25. When he gives this essentially judgment, this reconciliation of his resources that he's given to us. What if God called you to settle the account today? What if God in 10 minutes said, Keaton, I'm going to come and we're going to settle your account. We're going to settle all the resources I've deployed to you, all the things I've given to you. I'm going to receive a reconciliation of that today. Where would we stand? Would we be on the good side of it of again, no one's perfect, but when we look at the balance of the scales, God has deployed X number of resources to me, and here's what I've done to try to utilize those resources. Would the scales be relatively even, or would it be relatively out of whack? My fear is for many of us, myself included, it would be out of whack. If it happened today, it would be out of whack. Because God recognizes what we have, and he expects a return on that. He expects that you and I will have tried. Again, no particular result is required, but he expects us to try. I want to end with Matthew 25:23. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many. Come and share your master's happiness. Friends, that's what I want to hear one day. I want to get to judgment and I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. I want to enter into the kingdom. I want to be with God for eternity. And he makes he doesn't mince any words about what is going to be required of that one day. And part of that is serving and utilizing our abilities, is going out into the world and being deployed. This whole series is really a derivative of our Therefore Go year-long theme about being deployed, and part of that is serving. About whether it's serving here on this side, whether it's going into a foreign country, whether it's going to many of the various areas that we support. Where are we utilizing our gifts? Who's your one? Who is your one that you can go and serve today, tomorrow, Tuesday? Finding a need, meeting a need, and then returning. This morning, if you're not a Christian, we want to extend that invitation to you. I can't think of any better utilization of our time together to think about what it means to serve one another than to offer the invitation into Christ. To be able to come and to have our sins washed away through the blood of Christ. Maybe you just need prayers or support. Maybe you're going through a time. We'd love to help you with that as well. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?